Hey guys, tonight we begin with a quieter chapter of history, one that doesn't shout or clash with swords, but instead lingers in silence. So dim the lights a little, settle into wherever you're resting, and let your mind slow down. Before we drift further, I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? Somewhere in that calm moment, we'll gently step back into a world where war didn't end when the fighting stopped, especially for those who could no longer walk away from it. When we think about soldiers in ancient or medieval times, we often imagine strength, bravery, and dramatic survival against impossible odds. But the truth was far less cinematic and far more quiet. Most soldiers who were injured did not get heroic rescues or careful medical attention. They were simply left where they fell, because armies moved fast, and stopping for the wounded was rarely a priority. Efficiency mattered more than compassion, and survival depended on keeping the rest of the army moving. After a battle ended, the field would slowly settle into an eerie stillness. The clash of metal and shouting voices faded, replaced by scattered groans and the occasional call for help that no one was coming to answer. Injured soldiers lay where they had fallen, some barely conscious, others fully aware of their situation. And the uncomfortable truth was that many of them understood exactly what was going to happen next, because they had seen it before. In ancient times, such as during the campaigns of the Roman legions, there was some structure to caring for soldiers, at least compared to others. There were basic medical camps and trained individuals who could perform simple procedures. But even then, treatment was limited and often crude. If a wound was too severe, the soldier might not even be carried back. Harsh as it sounds, it was often more practical to leave him behind than to risk slowing the unit. For those who were lucky enough to be collected after battle, the experience was not exactly comforting. Treatment often involved tools that looked more like something from a blacksmith's workshop than a place of healing. Knives, hooks, and heated metal instruments were used to cut away damaged tissue or stop bleeding. And of course, all of this happened without anesthesia, which meant the patient remained very aware of every moment. In medieval Europe, things did not improve as much as one might hope. Medical knowledge was still limited, and much of it was based on tradition rather than science. Wounded soldiers might be taken to monasteries or makeshift shelters, where monks or local healers attempted to treat them. These caregivers were often well-meaning, but their understanding of infection, hygiene, and internal injuries was, let's say, not quite there yet. Infections were perhaps the greatest enemy of injured soldiers. A wound that might seem survivable at first could quickly become deadly. Without proper cleaning or sterile tools, bacteria spread easily, turning small injuries into life-threatening conditions. And because no one understood germs, treatments sometimes made things worse instead of better. Sometimes the only solution offered was amputation. If a limb was badly injured, removing it was seen as the best chance for survival. This was done quickly, often with basic tools and a strong assistant to hold the patient still. Survival depended on speed and luck, and even then, many did not make it through the process or the infection that followed. For those who were not treated at all, the outcome was usually slow and uncertain. Some died from blood loss or shock within hours. Others lingered for days, growing weaker as dehydration and infection took their toll. It was not dramatic or heroic. It was quiet, gradual, and often unnoticed once the army had moved on. Interestingly, not all injured soldiers were simply abandoned. In some cases, enemy forces would take them prisoner, especially if they were valuable in some way. However, being captured while injured was not necessarily better. Care depended entirely on the captors, and in many situations, resources were too limited to prioritize enemy wounded. Civilians sometimes played a role as well. After battles, local villagers might come to the fields, either to help survivors or, more commonly, to collect whatever valuables they could find. Occasionally, they would take in wounded soldiers and attempt to care for them, but this was inconsistent and depended heavily on circumstance and personal choice. In large-scale conflicts, the sheer number of injured made proper care nearly impossible. Even if an army wanted to treat its wounded, it often lacked the resources to do so effectively. Supplies were limited, transport was difficult, and time was always a pressing concern. The result was a system where many simply slipped through the cracks. There is also the psychological side to consider, although people at the time did not describe it in modern terms. Soldiers who survived injuries often carried lasting mental scars. They had seen the aftermath of battle up close, sometimes lying among the wounded for hours or days. The experience left a quiet mark that followed them long after the physical wounds had healed. In some cultures, injured soldiers who survived but could no longer fight faced a different kind of challenge. Without the ability to serve in the army, they might lose their primary source of income and identity. Support systems were limited, and many struggled to find their place in a society that valued strength and usefulness. Ancient texts occasionally mention these realities, though often in passing. Writers focused more on victories and leaders, leaving the ordinary soldier's fate largely unrecorded. When the wounded do appear in these accounts, it is usually as a brief detail, not a central story. They fade into the background, much like they did on the battlefield itself. Even in more organized armies, like those of later periods, improvements came slowly. Basic medical practices developed over time, but they were uneven and not always widely applied. A soldier's chances still depended heavily on luck, location, and the severity of the injury. It's also worth noting that the concept of triage, prioritizing treatment based on survivability, did not formally exist in most of these periods. Decisions about who received care were often made quickly and without clear guidelines. Those with the worst injuries were sometimes ignored, not out of cruelty, but because their chances were seen as too low. Weather and environment added another layer of difficulty. Cold temperatures could worsen injuries, while heat could accelerate infection. Rain turned battlefields into muddy hazards, making it harder to move the wounded and easier for wounds to become contaminated. Nature, in its quiet way, made everything just a little more difficult. Despite all of this, some soldiers did survive against the odds. Their recoveries were often long and incomplete, but they managed to continue their lives in whatever way they could. These stories were less about triumph and more about endurance, a slow and steady continuation rather than a dramatic comeback. Over time, small changes began to appear. Knowledge was shared, techniques improved, and attitudes toward the wounded slowly shifted. But these developments were gradual, and for most of history, they came too late for the majority of those who needed them. So when we look back at these periods, it's easy to focus on the battles themselves, the strategies, the leaders, the outcomes. But beneath all of that was a quieter reality, one that didn't make it into grand stories. It was the reality of the injured soldier, lying on the field, waiting for help that might never come, in a world that simply kept moving without him. If a soldier somehow managed to survive those first long hours after a battle, the story did not suddenly improve. In fact, survival often just meant entering a slower, more uncertain phase of suffering. The army by this point had usually already moved on, chasing victory or retreating from defeat, leaving behind a landscape that felt strangely empty. And in that emptiness, the wounded were left to figure out what survival actually meant without help, without structure, and without any clear path forward. For those who could still move, even slightly, the first instinct was simple: get off the battlefield. Not out of strategy, but out of quiet desperation. Crawling, dragging, or limping away from the open ground meant a slightly better chance of avoiding exposure, scavengers, or even returning enemy patrols. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow, exhausting, and often painfully quiet, with each movement reminding them exactly how badly they were injured. Sometimes groups of wounded soldiers would gather together, not because they had a plan, but because being alone felt worse. There was a kind of unspoken agreement among them, a shared understanding that none of them were in good shape and none of them had answers. They might exchange water if anyone still had some, or simply sit together in silence, listening to the wind move through what had recently been a place of chaos. Water, in fact, became one of the most urgent needs. Without organized supply lines or assistance, injured soldiers often had to rely on whatever they could find nearby. A stream, a puddle, even rainwater collected in a dented helmet. None of it was ideal, but all of it mattered. Dehydration could end a life just as surely as a wound, and sometimes faster than one might expect. Food was even less certain. A wounded soldier was not exactly in a position to hunt or forage effectively, especially if movement was limited. Some might have carried small rations, but those were never meant to last long. Hunger became a slow companion, not immediate enough to cause panic, but constant enough to weaken whatever strength remained. In rare cases, supply wagons or camp followers might return to the battlefield after the fighting had ended. These were not official rescue missions, but rather practical returns to collect usable equipment, weapons, and anything of value. If a wounded soldier was found during this process, there was a chance, just a chance, that he might be taken along. But this depended entirely on circumstances, and there was no guarantee. Camp followers themselves were an interesting part of this world. They were not soldiers, but they traveled with armies, providing services like cooking, repairing equipment, or trading goods. Some of them showed moments of unexpected compassion, helping injured men when they could. Others, understandably, focused on survival and profit, which meant the wounded were simply another part of the landscape. If a soldier managed to reach a nearby village, the outcome depended heavily on the people who lived there. Some villagers offered help, providing shelter, water, or basic care. Others were more cautious, especially if the soldier belonged to an enemy force. Fear of retaliation or lack of resources often made kindness a difficult choice. Even when help was given, it was usually limited. Villagers were not trained medical professionals, and their supplies were basic at best. Herbal remedies, bandages made from cloth, and simple rest were the main tools available. Sometimes this was enough to stabilize a wound. Other times, it only delayed the inevitable. There's also a quieter, more uncomfortable detail that often goes unspoken. Not every injured soldier wanted to survive, at least not in the condition they found themselves in. Severe injuries, especially those that resulted in permanent disability, meant a future that was uncertain and often harsh. Without support systems, survival could feel less like a victory and more like a long, difficult road with no clear destination. In many cases, soldiers who survived their injuries returned home changed in ways that went beyond the physical. A missing limb, a permanent limp or chronic pain became part of daily life. But so did something less visible, a kind of quiet distance from the world they had left behind before the war. Society at the time did not always have a clear place for these individuals. There were no structured rehabilitation programs or organized support networks. Some found work where they could, often in roles that required less physical effort. Others relied on family or community support, which was not always available. For those without support, begging became a common outcome. It wasn't seen as unusual, just another part of the social fabric. A former soldier, now unable to work, sitting by the roadside with a simple request for food or coins, was a familiar sight in many places. It was not dramatic, it was just normal. Interestingly, some cultures did attempt to honor wounded soldiers, at least in a symbolic way. Small pensions, land grants, or public recognition were occasionally offered, especially in more organized states. But these efforts were inconsistent and often limited to certain ranks or groups. The contrast between how society celebrated victory and how it treated the wounded is quietly striking. Victorious generals might receive parades, titles, and lasting recognition, while the injured soldiers who made that victory possible faded into the background. Their stories were rarely told, and their struggles were rarely recorded in detail. In literature and art from these periods, wounded soldiers sometimes appear, but often in a romanticized way. They are shown as noble, enduring figures, symbols of sacrifice and bravery. The reality, of course, was much less polished. It involved discomfort, uncertainty, and a daily negotiation with limitations. Let's drift for a moment into another setting, naval warfare. Injured sailors faced similar challenges, but with the added complication of being at sea. Treatment options were even more limited, and space was confined. A serious injury on a ship often meant a very uncertain outcome, with little room for recovery. Back on land, as time moved forward, small improvements in medical knowledge began to appear. Techniques were shared more widely, and some individuals dedicated themselves to studying wounds and treatments more carefully. But progress was slow, and for many generations, the basic experience of being an injured soldier remained largely unchanged. Weather, once again, played its quiet role. A wounded soldier trying to recover in cold conditions faced the risk of exposure, while heat increased the likelihood of infection. There was no escaping the environment, and it often determined outcomes just as much as the injury itself. Another subtle factor was time. The longer a soldier survived after an injury, the more uncertain things became. Immediate survival did not guarantee long-term recovery. Complications could arise days or even weeks later, turning what seemed like a manageable situation into something far more serious. And yet, through all of this, there was a kind of quiet resilience. Not the loud, heroic kind that fills stories, but a softer, more persistent form. The willingness to keep going, even when the outcome was unclear, became a defining feature of those who survived. So as we continue drifting through this quieter side of history, it becomes clear that being injured in the past was not just a single event. It was the beginning of a long, uncertain journey, one that depended on chance, environment, and the small, unpredictable kindness of others. And for many, it was a journey that unfolded far away from the grand narratives of history, in places where no one was really watching. If an injured soldier managed to survive not just the battlefield, but also those long, uncertain days afterward, they eventually entered a quieter phase of life. Not recovery in the modern sense, but something slower, something incomplete. Survival in these cases often meant learning how to exist with whatever remained, whether that was a damaged limb, constant pain, or simply the memory of how things used to feel before everything changed. The journey home, if there even was one, could take weeks or months. Roads were uneven, travel was slow, and injured bodies did not cooperate easily. Some soldiers joined caravans or small groups heading in the same direction. Others traveled alone, stopping often, resting wherever they could. It was not a triumphant return. There were no welcoming crowds waiting at the edge of town, just a quiet arrival, sometimes unnoticed. For many, home itself had changed. Families had adapted to life without them, assuming they might never return. Fields had been reassigned, responsibilities shifted, and daily routines settled into a new normal. So when a wounded soldier appeared at the doorway, it was not just a reunion, it was an adjustment for everyone involved. Physical limitations shaped everything that came next. Tasks that once felt simple, walking long distances, lifting tools, even standing for extended periods, became difficult or impossible. A farmer who had lost a leg could no longer tend his land in the same way. A labourer with a damaged arm might struggle to find consistent work. Survival now depended on adaptation, and not everyone managed it easily. Pain, too, became a constant companion. Not sharp and immediate like on the battlefield, but dull, persistent, and unpredictable. There were no reliable treatments for chronic pain, no structured therapies to ease discomfort. People simply endured it, adjusting their lives around something that never quite went away. And then there was the quieter side of recovery, the part that wasn't visible. Soldiers carried memories with them, not in dramatic flashes, but in small, lingering details. The sound of distant shouting, the stillness after chaos, the feeling of being left behind. These memories didn't always announce themselves, but they stayed, shaping how a person moved through the world. Communities responded in different ways. Some welcomed returning soldiers with a sense of duty, offering support where they could. Others were less accommodating, especially if resources were already limited. A wounded individual who could not contribute fully might be seen as a burden, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. In certain cases, religious institutions provided a form of stability. Monasteries, temples, and similar places sometimes offered shelter and care for those who had nowhere else to go. Life in these settings was structured and quiet, which suited many who had experienced the unpredictability of war. It was not luxury, but it was something close to safety. There were also those who turned their experiences into a different kind of role. A former soldier might become a storyteller, sharing accounts of battles and survival, not always for fame, but simply as a way to make sense of what had happened. These stories, passed from person to person, became part of local memory, even if they never made it into official records. Let's drift gently into another layer of this reality, the role of status. Not all soldiers were treated the same after injury. Those of higher rank or noble background often had better chances of receiving care and support. They might have access to private healers, better living conditions, and a social network that could sustain them. Meanwhile, the ordinary foot soldier faced a much steeper path. In some regions, early forms of compensation began to appear. A small stipend, a piece of land, or a reduced tax burden might be granted to injured veterans. These measures were inconsistent and often limited, but they represented a slow shift in thinking, a quiet acknowledgement that those who had served and suffered deserved something in return. Even so, these efforts were far from universal. Many injured soldiers fell through the gaps, living on the edges of society. They formed a kind of informal community, recognizing each other by shared experience rather than formal identity. A limp, a missing limb, a certain way of moving. These became subtle signals of a life that had taken a difficult turn. Daily life settled into routines that were shaped by limitation, but also by persistence. Simple tasks were broken down into smaller steps. Time was managed carefully, energy conserved where possible. There was a rhythm to it, not fast or efficient, but steady enough to keep going. Interestingly, some individuals developed new skills that had little to do with their previous lives. A former soldier might learn a craft that required less physical strain, carving, weaving, or basic trade work. These transitions were not always smooth, but they showed a kind of quiet adaptability that rarely gets mentioned in grand historical narratives. Family dynamics also shifted. Injured soldiers who relied on relatives for support changed the balance within households. Roles were adjusted, expectations redefined. In some cases, this strengthened bonds. In others, it created tension. It depended on personalities, resources, and the slow passage of time. Children growing up around these individuals absorbed their stories in subtle ways. Not through formal lessons, but through observation and occasional conversation. They saw what injury looked like. They understood, even if only partially, the cost of war, and that understanding shaped how they viewed the world. Let's move gently into the broader picture again. As generations passed, societies began to accumulate these experiences. Patterns emerged. People noticed what worked and what didn't, even if they didn't fully understand why. This gradual awareness laid the groundwork for future improvements, though at the time it likely felt very slow. Medical knowledge, while still limited, continued to evolve. Observations were recorded, techniques refined, and a few individuals dedicated themselves to studying the human body with more care. Progress was uneven, but it was there, moving quietly in the background. At the same time, cultural attitudes toward injury began to shift, ever so slightly. Instead of viewing wounded soldiers solely as broken or burdensome, there was a growing, if subtle, recognition of endurance. Not heroic in the loud sense, but meaningful in a quieter way. And yet, despite these small changes, the fundamental reality remained. Being injured in earlier periods of history meant entering a life that was less certain, less supported, and often less visible. It meant carrying both physical and emotional weight without the structures we take for granted today. So, as we continue drifting through this story, it becomes clear that survival was not the end of the journey. It was simply a transition into something else, a slower, quieter chapter, where the focus shifted from enduring a moment to enduring a lifetime. And in that quiet endurance, in those small daily adjustments and unseen struggles, we find a different kind of history. Not the kind written in bold lines and grand victories, but one that unfolds gently in the background, where most lives have always existed. As time moved forward, the lives of injured soldiers settled into something that felt almost invisible to the larger world. Wars continued, kings argued, borders shifted, and somewhere in the background, the people who had once stood in those battles carried on in quieter, slower ways. Their presence didn't disappear, but it softened, blending into everyday life until it became part of the landscape rather than something people stopped to notice. In towns and villages, you might find them sitting near market squares, not in any official capacity, just there. Some would speak if approached, others preferred silence. Their clothing was often practical rather than neat, worn down by time and use. There was no uniform anymore, no symbol tying them to their past role, except for the subtle signs their bodies carried. People passed by, sometimes offering a nod, sometimes a coin, sometimes nothing at all. It wasn't necessarily unkind. It was just familiar. The presence of injured veterans became one of those things that existed without drawing attention, like the creaking of old wood in a house you've lived in for years. Over time, small, informal systems of support began to take shape, not organized by governments or institutions, but by habit and community. A baker might set aside leftover bread. A farmer might allow someone to help with lighter tasks in exchange for food. These were quiet arrangements, unspoken agreements that helped people get through their days. But even within these systems, there was a certain fragility. Support depended on goodwill, and goodwill could change. A bad harvest, an economic strain, or even a shift in local leadership could reduce what little help was available. For injured soldiers living on the edge, stability was always uncertain. Let's drift, gently, into the rhythm of their daily lives. Mornings often began slowly. Movement required effort, especially for those dealing with stiffness or pain. There was no rushing out the door. Everything unfolded at a measured pace, shaped by what the body would allow on any given day. Work, when possible, was adapted rather than abandoned. Someone who could no longer lift heavy tools might take on tasks that required patience instead of strength. Repairing small items, watching over livestock, or assisting in simple trades became ways to remain connected to the flow of life. It wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. There's a quiet irony here. Many of these individuals had once been part of something fast-moving and intense, marching, fighting, reacting in moments. And now their lives were defined by slowness, by careful steps, by pauses. It's the kind of contrast history doesn't always highlight, but it sits there, gently, if you look for it. Social interactions also shifted in subtle ways. Injured soldiers were neither fully inside nor completely outside the communities they lived in. They occupied a kind of middle space, known, recognized, but not always deeply engaged. Conversations were often brief, polite, and then life moved on. Festivals and gatherings could feel particularly distant. These events were full of movement, noise, and energy. Things that didn't always align with the slower rhythm of someone recovering from injury. Some participated quietly, standing at the edges, observing more than engaging. Others chose to stay away altogether. And yet, there were moments of connection, small ones, a shared story, a quiet laugh, a recognition between people who understood something without needing to explain it fully. These moments didn't change the larger picture, but they added a layer of warmth to an otherwise restrained existence. If we widen the lens again, we begin to see how these individual lives influenced society in subtle ways. Over generations, the presence of injured soldiers created a kind of collective awareness. People began to understand, even without formal education, that war had lasting effects. Not just on the battlefield, but long after. This awareness didn't immediately lead to structured change, but it planted seeds. Ideas about responsibility, care, and the cost of conflict slowly took shape. They weren't written into laws right away. They existed first as quiet observations, passed through experience rather than instruction. Let's float gently into another setting, larger cities. Here, the experience could be both easier and harder. Easier, because there were more opportunities to blend in, to find small roles, to survive without standing out too much. Harder, because cities could also be indifferent, their pace leaving little room for those who couldn't keep up. In urban spaces, injured soldiers sometimes formed loose groups, drawn together by shared experience. Not formal organizations, just familiar faces gathering in familiar places. There was a comfort in that recognition, a sense of not being entirely alone in a very large, very busy world. Some of these individuals found their way into roles that didn't rely on physical strength. Messengers, gatekeepers, assistants in workshops, positions that required presence more than power. These roles were modest, but they offered a kind of stability that was otherwise hard to find. Meanwhile, in the background, medical understanding continued its slow, uneven growth. Observations about wounds, healing, and recovery accumulated over time. People began to notice patterns, even if they didn't fully understand the reasons behind them. Clean wounds tended to do better. Rest mattered. Certain treatments seemed to help more than others. But these insights spread gradually, and not always consistently. One region might adopt a slightly improved practice, while another continued with older methods. For injured soldiers, this meant that outcomes still varied widely depending on where they were and who treated them. There's also a quieter emotional layer that becomes more visible over time. Acceptance. Not in a dramatic, sudden way, but slowly, day by day. Living with injury required a kind of adjustment that didn't happen all at once. It unfolded through repetition, through doing the same tasks, facing the same limitations, and finding small ways to adapt. For some, this led to a sense of calm, not happiness exactly, but a steady understanding of their place in the world. For others, the adjustment was more difficult, marked by frustration or a lingering sense of loss. Both experiences existed side by side, often within the same community. As the years passed, the distinction between former soldier and ordinary person began to blur. Time softened identities. Injuries remained, but the context around them shifted. New generations grew up, new conflicts emerged, and the stories of past battles faded into the background. And yet, the quiet legacy of those injured lives remained. Not in grand monuments or detailed records, but in the subtle ways societies learned to accommodate difference, to make space, however imperfectly, for those who moved at a different pace. So as we continue this slow drift through history, it becomes clear that the fate of injured soldiers was not defined by a single moment. It was shaped by time, by environment, by the small everyday choices of the people around them, and in that long quiet after the noise, we find a different kind of story. One that doesn't rush or demand attention, but simply continues, steady, understated, and deeply human in its own calm, persistent way. As we drift into the final stretch of this story, something subtle begins to change. Not suddenly, and certainly not everywhere at once, but gradually, almost quietly, attitudes toward injured soldiers start to shift. It isn't driven by a single discovery or a moment of realization, but by accumulation. Generations of seeing the same outcomes, the same struggles, the same quiet endings begin to leave an impression. At first, these changes are small, almost easy to miss. A commander deciding to bring along a few extra wagons, not just for supplies, but for those who can't walk. A healer taking a little more time to clean a wound, noticing that it seems to help. These are not grand reforms. They are adjustments, shaped by observation rather than theory. In some organized armies, especially as we move into later historical periods, there is a growing awareness that preserving soldiers, even injured ones, has value. Not just moral value, but practical value. A soldier who survives can still contribute, even if not on the battlefield. He can train others, share experience, or take on roles that don't require full physical strength. This idea doesn't spread evenly, of course. Some leaders adopt it, others ignore it. But it exists now in a way it didn't before. And that quiet shift begins to influence how armies prepare for and respond to injury. It's no longer always about leaving people behind. Sometimes it's about finding a way to bring them back. Let's ease into the development of early medical spaces, not quite hospitals as we know them, but designated areas where the wounded could be gathered and treated. These spaces were often basic, tents, repurposed buildings, or sections of camps, but they represented a change in thinking. The wounded were no longer entirely an afterthought. Within these spaces, practices slowly improved. Tools were still crude, but they were used with slightly more care. There was more attention to cleaning wounds, more effort to manage pain, even if the methods were limited. It wasn't modern medicine, but it was a step away from complete improvisation. Interestingly, certain individuals began to stand out during this time. People who focused specifically on healing rather than fighting. Surgeons, healers, early medical practitioners who paid close attention to what worked and what didn't. Their knowledge was often hard-earned, built through trial, error, and careful observation. As their experience grew, so did the sharing of that knowledge. Techniques were written down, discussed, and passed from one person to another. Slowly, patterns became clearer. Certain treatments led to better outcomes. Certain practices reduced suffering. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. At the same time, societies outside the battlefield began to adapt as well. There was a growing, if still limited, recognition that injured soldiers were not just temporary problems to be managed. but individuals who would continue to exist within the community. This led to early forms of structured support in some regions. Pensions, though often small and inconsistent, became slightly more common. Land grants, particularly for those who had served loyally, offered a way to maintain independence. These measures didn't solve every problem, but they provided a foundation that hadn't existed before. Let's drift gently into the emotional landscape again. With these changes came a subtle shift in perception. Injured soldiers were no longer seen solely as reminders of loss or burden. There was a growing sense, quiet, understated, that they represented endurance, that surviving, even in a diminished state, held its own kind of meaning. This shift didn't erase hardship. Daily life was still shaped by limitation, pain, and uncertainty, but it added a layer of recognition that had often been missing, a kind of acknowledgement that what these individuals had experienced mattered, even if it wasn't always spoken aloud. In larger historical terms, these gradual changes laid the groundwork for what would come much later: the development of more organized medical systems, the idea of dedicated care for the wounded, and eventually the creation of institutions specifically designed to support them. But here, in this quieter period, those ideas are still forming. There's also an interesting contrast to notice. Even as care slowly improves, war itself does not become less damaging. In many ways, it becomes more so. Larger armies, more complex weapons, and longer campaigns mean more injuries, not fewer. So while the response to injury evolves, the scale of the problem continues to grow. This creates a kind of tension, progress on one side, increasing challenge on the other. And in the middle, the individual soldier, still experiencing injury in deeply personal, immediate ways, still navigating recovery one day at a time. If we return for a moment to the image of the battlefield, it looks slightly different now. Not completely transformed, but altered. There are more attempts to collect the wounded, more effort to provide immediate care. The silence after battle is still there, but it is less absolute than before. And yet, despite all these changes, the core experience remains familiar. Injury still brings uncertainty. Recovery is still uneven. Outcomes still depend on a mix of luck, location, and available knowledge. The difference is that there is now, at least sometimes, a pathway forward. As time continues to move, these pathways become more defined. What begins as scattered improvements slowly turns into structured systems. Medical knowledge expands, organizations form, and the idea of caring for the wounded becomes a recognized responsibility rather than an occasional choice. But that is a story for another time. For now, we remain in this transitional space, where the old ways and the new ideas exist side by side, where a wounded soldier might still be left behind, or might be carried to safety, depending on circumstances. So when we look back across this entire journey, from the silent battlefields where the injured were left to fate, to the early efforts to bring them back and care for them, we see a pattern that is both simple and complex. Change, but slowly. Improvement, but unevenly. And through it all, the constant presence of individuals adapting, enduring, and continuing in whatever way they could. Their stories are not loud. They don't demand attention, but they are there, steady and persistent, forming a quiet thread that runs through the larger fabric of history. As we let this topic settle, there's something almost calming in its consistency, not in the hardship itself, but in the way people respond to it, again and again, across different times and places, adjusting, learning, carrying on. And maybe that's where we leave it tonight, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with that softer understanding, that behind every battle, beyond every victory or defeat, there were lives that continued in quieter ways, slower ways, often unseen, but never entirely gone. So as you rest, wherever you are, let that thought drift gently in the background. History is not only made in moments of noise and action, it is also shaped in silence, in recovery, and in the long, quiet effort of simply continuing forward. The first thing to understand about siege warfare is that it was, in essence, a very slow argument between two groups of people who absolutely refused to share space. One side stayed inside thick walls, pretending everything was fine, while the other side stood outside, staring at those walls like an annoyed neighbor who had decided knocking politely was no longer an option. And this could go on for weeks, months, sometimes even years, because medieval people had patience in a way that feels almost unsettling today. Life inside a besieged city was not immediately dramatic. At first, it could feel almost normal. Markets might still open, bread might still be baked. Guards would stand on the walls, peering down with that slightly smug confidence of people who believed stone was an unbeatable life hack. There was a quiet assumption that the enemy would get bored or hungry or distracted by some other war and just leave. Of course, that assumption had a habit of aging poorly. Outside the walls, things were not exactly glamorous either. The besieging army had to build camps, dig trenches, and settle into what was essentially an extended, uncomfortable outdoor stay with very limited entertainment. Soldiers dealt with mud, bad weather, and food that could politely be described as functional. There was a lot of waiting for supplies, waiting for orders, waiting for the people inside to run out of patience, food, or hope. It was less about heroic charges and more about who could endure boredom longer. As days turned into weeks, the tone inside the city would begin to shift. Supplies, which once seemed plentiful, started to feel finite. Bread got smaller. Meat became rarer. People began to notice how often they were thinking about food, which is never a great sign. Leaders would assure everyone that everything was under control, because of course they would. But behind closed doors, even they were quietly counting sacks of grain and wondering how long optimism could realistically last. Water, oddly enough, could become just as important as food. Cities with wells or access to rivers had a clear advantage, while those without were suddenly very aware of every drop. If an attacker managed to cut off water sources, things escalated quickly from inconvenient to deeply unpleasant. Thirst is not something that lends itself to patience, and once it set in, the calm rhythm of siege life began to crack. Meanwhile, outside the walls, the attackers were not entirely idle. Siege warfare had a certain creativity to it. Engineers would design machines with names that sounded almost cheerful, like trebuchets and battering rams, which were, in practice, very committed to the idea of breaking things. There was a strange calm to the preparation, wood being cut, ropes being tightened, angles being measured, all done with the quiet understanding that eventually something very heavy would be launched at something very solid. The first time a large stone came crashing into a city wall, it had a way of changing the mood instantly. Inside, people would hear the impact echo through the streets, a dull, heavy reminder that the outside world had not forgotten them. Dust would fall from buildings. Guards would exchange glances that said, without words, that this might take a while. And it usually did, because walls were stubborn things, built specifically for this kind of attention. Inside the city, daily life began to shrink. Activities that once filled the day were replaced with quieter, more cautious routines. People stayed closer to home. Conversations became shorter, often circling back to the same topics: food, safety, rumors. Rumors were especially popular because when information is scarce, imagination tends to step in and do most of the work, often in ways that were not particularly comforting. Leadership during a siege was a delicate performance. Rulers had to appear calm, confident, and completely unbothered. even as the situation slowly tightened around them. They would hold meetings, make speeches, and issue reassurances, all while quietly hoping the numbers would hold. Because once the numbers, food, water, morale, started to slip too far, no speech in the world could quite fix it. Outside, the attackers faced their own quiet struggles. Disease was a constant companion in these long encampments. Sanitation was, at best, a loose suggestion, and when large groups of people live close together with limited resources, things tend to deteriorate in ways that are neither quick nor pleasant. Soldiers who had expected glory found themselves dealing with coughs, fevers, and the slow realization that war was, more often than not, deeply inconvenient. Weather added another layer to this slow contest. Rain turned camps into mud. Cold seeped into tents. Heat made everything feel heavier and slower. The besieged had walls to hide behind, but the besiegers had the sky, which was not always cooperative. And yet both sides endured, because neither wanted to be the one to give in first. Back inside the city, food shortages became harder to ignore. People began to ration more carefully. Meals became simpler, then smaller, then sometimes optional. There was a quiet hierarchy to scarcity. The wealthy might still find ways to eat a little better, while the poor felt the strain sooner and more sharply. It was not a fair system, but fairness was rarely a priority in these situations. Animals were often among the first to disappear from the menu. Horses, dogs, even pigeons, anything that could be eaten eventually was. It was not discussed loudly, but everyone noticed. The absence of familiar sights, like horses in the streets or birds in the squares, created a strange emptiness, as if the city itself was slowly being reduced. Morale, that fragile and invisible resource, began to wear down. At first, people told themselves stories of rescue, of allies arriving just in time, of the enemy giving up. But as days stretched into months, those stories became harder to believe. Silence replaced optimism. People spoke less about the future and more about the present, which was already difficult enough. The attackers, sensing this gradual decline, might increase their efforts. More bombardment, more attempts to undermine walls, sometimes even psychological tactics, like displaying captured prisoners or sending messages designed to unsettle those inside. It was not always dramatic, but it was persistent, like a slow drip that eventually wears down even the strongest stone. Inside, cracks could begin to form, not in the walls, but among the people. Disagreements over resources, over leadership, over what should be done next. Some might argue for holding out, believing relief would come. Others might quietly suggest surrender, not out of weakness, but out of a very practical desire to survive. These conversations were rarely easy and never entirely resolved. Starvation, when it truly set in, changed everything. It was not sudden. It crept in, day by day, meal by meal, until hunger became the defining feature of existence. People grew weaker, movements slowed. Even thinking became harder as the body focused on the most basic need, finding something, anything to eat. At this stage, the idea of surrender began to feel less like failure and more like relief. The walls, once symbols of safety, started to feel like a trap. And yet, surrender was not a simple decision. There was always the question of what would happen next, because the people outside those walls were not exactly known for their generosity. Meanwhile, the besieging army faced its own quiet doubts. Sieges were expensive, time-consuming and uncertain. Supplies had to be maintained, soldiers had to be kept in line, and there was always the possibility that another enemy might appear, turning the situation into something even more complicated. So even as they waited for the city to break, they were also watching the horizon, just in case. And so the siege would continue, this slow, grinding contest of endurance. No grand charges, No sudden victories, just days blending into nights, punctuated by the occasional crash of stone against wall or the quiet realization that another sack of grain had run out. It was war, but stretched thin, like a story that refused to end. Eventually, something would give. It always did. A gate might open, a wall might fall, or the people inside might simply decide they could not continue. And when that moment came, it was rarely dramatic. More often, it was quiet. A tired decision at the end of a very long wait, marking the close of a chapter that had been less about battle and more about survival. By the time a siege reached its middle phase, if we can even call it that, because time had a habit of losing structure, everything became slower, quieter, and slightly more uncomfortable than anyone had originally planned. Inside the city, people stopped asking how long the siege would last. Not because they didn't care, but because the question itself had started to feel a bit unrealistic. It was like asking when winter would end, except winter was made of stone walls, empty granaries, and a growing sense of unease. Food, of course, remained the central character in this very drawn-out story. At first, rationing had been organized, almost polite. Officials distributed portions carefully, records were kept, and there was a vague sense that order could be maintained indefinitely. But as supplies thinned, that order began to fray. Portions shrank again, then again. Eventually, meals became something closer to a suggestion than a certainty. People developed a very intimate awareness of hunger. It wasn't just the feeling of an empty stomach, it was the constant presence of it, like a quiet companion that followed you everywhere. Conversations drifted toward recipes no one could currently make. Memories of past feasts became oddly vivid. Even the smell of food, when it appeared, could feel overwhelming in a way that was almost unfair. Meanwhile, those in positions of power had to maintain a careful balance. They needed to ration strictly enough to prolong survival, but not so harshly that the population turned against them. This was not an easy task, because when people are hungry, they tend to become less interested in long-term strategy and more focused on immediate needs, which is entirely understandable, if slightly inconvenient for leadership. Outside the walls, the besieging forces were beginning to feel the weight of time as well. What had once seemed like a straightforward operation, surround the city, wait for surrender, had turned into something more complex. Supplies needed to be replenished regularly. Lines of communication had to be maintained, and soldiers who had perhaps imagined a quicker resolution found themselves settling into a routine that was less about combat and more about endurance. The camps themselves became small, temporary communities. There were routines. Guards rotated shifts. Meals were prepared, often repetitive and uninspired. Repairs were constant, because tents and equipment have a tendency to wear down when exposed to weather for extended periods. It was not glamorous, but it was necessary. War, in this form, was less about action and more about persistence. Back inside the city, creative solutions to hunger began to emerge. And creative here should be read with a certain level of caution. Foods that had once been ignored or considered undesirable suddenly became quite important. Roots, weeds, anything remotely edible was collected and consumed. Recipes were adjusted, simplified, or quietly abandoned in favor of whatever could be made from whatever remained. There was also a subtle shift in how people viewed value. Gold and silver, once symbols of wealth, became less useful in a situation where bread was far more important. A loaf could mean another day of strength, another day of survival. Wealth, in the traditional sense, became almost abstract, while practical resources took center stage in a very immediate way. As weeks turned into months, physical strength began to fade across the population. People moved more slowly. Tasks that had once been routine required more effort. Even standing for long periods could feel exhausting. The city, which had once been lively and active, took on a quieter, more subdued rhythm, as if it too were conserving energy. Morale, always delicate, became increasingly fragile. At first, people had drawn comfort from shared experience. There was a sense of unity, of facing a common challenge together. But over time, that unity could begin to strain. Frustrations surfaced. Small disagreements felt larger. The patience that had once held everything together started to wear thin. Rumors, as they often do, filled the gaps left by uncertainty. Some spoke of relief armies on the way just beyond the horizon. Others whispered of betrayals, secret negotiations, or plans to abandon the city altogether. These stories spread quickly, not because they were true, but because they offered something: hope, explanation, or simply distraction from the present reality. Outside, the attackers continued their steady work. Siege engines were maintained, adjusted, sometimes improved. There was a quiet pride in their construction, a sense that engineering could achieve what brute force alone could not. Watching a trebuchet operate, with its careful balance and measured release, was almost methodical. A reminder that even in war there was a certain appreciation for precision. But even precision could not speed things up significantly. Walls were resilient, and cities were stubborn. Each impact, each attempt to breach defenses, was just one small step in a very long process. The attackers, like those inside, had to accept that this was not a quick story. It was a gradual one, unfolding at its own pace. Disease, which had lingered in the background, began to take a more noticeable role on both sides. Inside the city, weakened bodies were more vulnerable. Illness spread more easily, and recovery became more difficult. Outside, crowded camps and limited sanitation created similar challenges. It was an equal opportunity problem, quietly affecting everyone involved. In response, both sides did what they could, which was not always much. Remedies were attempted. Isolation was sometimes practiced, but medical knowledge was limited, and resources were stretched thin. Illness became another factor in the slow equation of the siege, one that no one could fully control. Inside the walls, decisions became increasingly difficult. Leaders had to consider options that once seemed unthinkable. Should they attempt to break out? Risky, unpredictable, and likely costly. Should they continue to hold out, hoping for relief that might or might not arrive? Or should they begin to consider surrender, with all the uncertainty that entailed? These were not decisions made lightly. Each option carried its own consequences, none of them particularly appealing. And so, discussions stretched on, often without clear resolution. Time, as always, continued to pass, quietly pressing the issue forward. For the ordinary people within the city, these high-level debates mattered less than the immediate reality. They were focused on getting through each day, finding food, staying safe, supporting family members who might be struggling more than they were. Survival, in its simplest form, became the primary goal. There was also a growing sense of isolation. The outside world, once connected through trade and travel, now felt distant and unreachable. The city existed in its own small bubble, cut off and self-contained. News, when it arrived at all, was rare and often unreliable. People were left to imagine what might be happening beyond the walls. Outside, the besiegers faced their own version of isolation. Though they were technically in the open, their focus was entirely fixed on the city before them. The rest of the world faded into the background, replaced by the daily routine of maintaining the siege. It was a narrow existence, defined by a single objective. Occasionally there might be moments of direct interaction between the two sides, messages exchanged, negotiations attempted, offers made, considered, and sometimes rejected. These moments were brief but significant, small breaks in the otherwise steady pattern of waiting and watching, and through it all, the central tension remained unchanged. The city held on, slowly weakening. The attackers persisted, steadily applying pressure. Neither side could easily walk away, and neither could quickly win. It was a stalemate, but not a static one, more like a slow-moving current, carrying both sides toward an inevitable conclusion. As the siege continued, one thing became increasingly clear. This was not a story of sudden heroics or dramatic turns. It was a story of endurance, of how long people could wait, how much they could withstand, and how eventually even the strongest walls and the most determined defenders would begin to feel the weight of time pressing in. And so the days went on, quietly, gradually, with each sunrise and sunset blending into the next, until the idea of normal life felt like something from a distant past, and the present, this slow, relentless siege, became the only reality anyone could remember. By the later stages of a siege, something subtle but very important began to change. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. It was more like a quiet shift in the air, the kind you only notice after it has already settled in. Inside the city, people stopped thinking in terms of if and started thinking in terms of when. When the food would finally run out, when the walls might fail, when the long wait would simply end. Hunger, by now, had moved beyond discomfort and into something more constant, more defining. It shaped the rhythm of the day. Waking up meant feeling it. Trying to sleep meant feeling it. Even simple tasks required effort that the body no longer quite had. People became thinner, quieter, more inward. Conversations lost their energy. Words were used sparingly, as if even speaking required too much strength. The streets themselves reflected this change. Where there had once been movement and noise, there was now a slower, more careful pace. Doors stayed closed longer. Windows opened less often. The city, in a way, seemed to fold in on itself, conserving whatever little energy remained. Even the sounds were different, softer, fewer, as though the entire place was trying not to draw attention to its own fragility. Food, or the lack of it, had by now rewritten every rule of daily life. Things that would once have been dismissed without a second thought were now considered valuable. Anything edible, even remotely, was used. There was no room left for preference or taste. Survival had reduced choices down to a very simple question. Can this keep someone going for another day? Leadership, at this stage, faced its most difficult role. Maintaining order was no longer about reassurance or planning. It was about holding together something that was actively falling apart. Decisions had to be made quickly, often with incomplete information, and always under pressure. The margin for error had disappeared, leaving only difficult choices and their consequences. Among the population, trust could begin to erode. Not always openly, not always dramatically, but quietly. People wondered if resources were being distributed fairly, if leaders were telling the truth, if someone, somewhere, had a better plan that wasn't being shared. These thoughts lingered, growing slowly, fed by uncertainty, and the simple fact that when survival is at stake, doubt tends to appear. Outside the walls, the attackers were beginning to notice the change as well. There were fewer movements on the ramparts, fewer signs of activity. The city looked tired, and while that might have seemed like progress, it also required patience. Because even a weakened city could hold on longer than expected, especially when the alternative, surrender, carried its own risks. The besieging army, though still in control of the situation, was not entirely comfortable either. Time had stretched their resources. Supplies needed constant replenishment. Morale had its own ups and downs. Soldiers who had been confident at the beginning now understood that victory, while likely, was not immediate. It had to be waited for, carefully and consistently. Back inside, illness had taken a firmer hold. Weakened bodies struggled to resist even minor infections. Recovery was slow, uncertain. Care was limited, as resources had to be prioritized elsewhere. Families did what they could for one another, but there was only so much that could be done. Sickness became another quiet presence, moving through the city alongside hunger. At some point, the idea of a breakout would resurface. It always did. A desperate attempt to push through the enemy lines and escape, or perhaps to bring in supplies. It sounded bold, almost hopeful, but in reality, it was deeply risky. Exhausted defenders facing a prepared enemy outside the walls. It was not a plan with high odds. Still, desperation has a way of making even unlikely options feel necessary. For many, the thought of surrender began to feel less like giving up and more like choosing a different kind of survival. The walls, once a source of protection, now felt restrictive. The idea of opening the gates, of ending the waiting, held a strange kind of appeal. But it was never a simple choice, because surrender meant placing trust in the very people who had been trying to break you. Negotiations, if they occurred, were careful and cautious. Messages sent out under flags of truce. Terms discussed in measured tones. Both sides understood the stakes. The defenders wanted safety, or at least some assurance of it. The attackers wanted control, and perhaps an example to discourage others from resisting in the future. It was a delicate balance, shaped by circumstances more than goodwill. Meanwhile, time continued its steady movement. Days passed, each one blending into the next. The routines, such as they were, remained. Guards stood watch, fires were lit. Meals, however small, were prepared. Life did not stop, even in these conditions. It simply adjusted, becoming quieter, more focused, more minimal. Among the attackers, there was also a sense of nearing conclusion. Not excitement exactly, but anticipation. The long wait was almost over. The effort, the patience, the discomfort, it was all leading somewhere. But even here there was caution, because the final moments of a siege could be unpredictable, and no one wanted to assume too much too soon. Inside the city, small signs of strain became more visible. Repairs to the walls slowed. Guards appeared more fatigued. The organization that had once defined the defense began to loosen. Not completely, but enough to be noticed. These were not dramatic failures, just small shifts that, taken together, indicated a system under pressure. People adapted in quiet ways. They moved less, spoke less, conserved energy wherever possible. There was a kind of unspoken understanding that everyone was doing what they could with what little they had left. It wasn't hopeful exactly, but it was steady. And sometimes steadiness was enough to carry things forward a little longer. The outside world, for those inside, had become almost abstract. The siege had narrowed their focus so completely that everything beyond the walls felt distant, almost unreal. Memories of normal life, markets, travel, open roads, felt like something from another time, another place. The present was all-consuming, leaving little room for anything else. Eventually, the pressure reached a point where something had to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but inevitably. The balance that had held the siege in place began to tilt. Whether through negotiation, collapse, or simple exhaustion, the end approached in its own quiet way. And when that moment came, it rarely looked like the stories people might imagine. There were no grand speeches echoing through the streets, no sudden bursts of action. More often it was a series of small decisions made by tired people, leading to a single outcome. A gate opened, a signal given, a long wait brought to a close. For those inside, it marked the end of one kind of struggle and the beginning of another. For those outside, it was the completion of a task that had required patience more than anything else. And for both, it served as a reminder that siege warfare was never about quick victories. It was about time, endurance, and the slow, quiet breaking of resistance. And so, as the dust settled and the long silence of the siege began to lift, what remained was not a sense of triumph or defeat in the dramatic sense, but something far more subdued, a quiet acknowledgement of what had been endured, a long, drawn-out chapter finally closing, leaving behind a city and people forever changed by the simple, relentless passage of time. When the end of a siege finally arrived, it did not rush in with noise or excitement. It came slowly, almost politely, like someone entering a room after knocking for far too long. A gate would open, sometimes just a little at first, as if even the hinges were unsure about this decision. There were no cheers, no dramatic music, just a quiet shift, as one long phase of waiting gave way to something else entirely. For the people inside, the moment carried a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. The waiting was over, which in itself felt like a kind of victory. But what replaced it was unknown, and that uncertainty sat heavily in the air. People stepped out carefully or watched from windows, trying to understand what this new reality would look like. It was not celebration. It was something much more subdued. The attackers, for their part, did not always rush in immediately. There was a process, often cautious, sometimes formal. Agreements, if they had been made, needed to be honored, or at least acknowledged. Troops moved in with a measured pace, aware that even at the end, a siege could still hold surprises. Control was established gradually, not with a burst, but with steady, deliberate steps. Inside the city, the physical effects of the siege were impossible to ignore. Buildings showed signs of strain. Walls bore the marks of repeated impacts. Streets, once active, had an emptier feel. But more noticeable than any structural damage was the condition of the people themselves. Thin, tired, and quiet, they carried the visible weight of everything they had endured. The attackers, for their part, did not always rush in immediately. There was a process, often cautious, sometimes formal. Agreements, if they had been made, needed to be honored, or at least acknowledged. Troops moved in with a measured pace, aware that even at the end, a siege could still hold surprises. Control was established gradually, not with a burst, but with steady, deliberate steps. Inside the city, the physical effects of the siege were impossible to ignore. Buildings showed signs of strain. Walls bore the marks of repeated impacts. Streets, once active, had an emptier feel. But more noticeable than any structural damage was the condition of the people themselves. Thin, tired, and quiet, they carried the visible weight of everything they had endured. Food suddenly became available again, though not always immediately or in abundance. Even small amounts made a difference. The first proper meal after a long period of hunger had a way of feeling almost unreal. But the body, after such deprivation, did not always adjust quickly. Recovery was slow, careful. There was no instant return to normal, only a gradual rebuilding. For those who had held positions of leadership inside the city, the end of the siege marked a complicated transition. Their authority, once absolute within the walls, was now subject to the will of those who had surrounded them. Some retained roles in a new order. Others quietly faded into the background. Their long effort to maintain control had reached its natural conclusion. Among the attackers, there was a sense of completion, but not necessarily joy. Sieges were not quick victories that inspired celebration. They were long, exhausting processes that drained resources and energy. Finishing one felt more like crossing something off a list than achieving a dramatic triumph. The work was done, and that in itself was enough. The city, now under new control, entered a period of adjustment. Systems had to be re-established, supplies organized, order maintained. It was not an immediate transformation, but a gradual one. Life began to return, piece by piece, though it was never quite the same as before. Too much had changed. Too much had been lost. For the ordinary people, the focus shifted quickly to recovery, finding food, rebuilding homes, reconnecting with others. These became the priorities. The siege, while still present in memory, gave way to the practical needs of daily life. Survival had been the goal during the siege. Now it was about moving forward, however slowly that might happen. There was also a quiet process of remembering. Stories were shared, not loudly, but in small conversations. Who had endured what? How people had managed. These stories were not dramatic retellings, but simple accounts, shaped by personal experience. They formed a kind of collective memory, something that would linger long after the physical signs of the siege had faded. Outside the city, the besieging army did not remain forever. Once control was secured and systems were in place, they moved on. Another objective, another campaign. The city, which had been the center of their attention for so long, became just one part of a larger picture. War, after all, had a way of continuing, regardless of individual outcomes. Back within the walls, the sense of isolation gradually lifted. Trade routes reopened. Messages traveled again. The world beyond the city returned, slowly reconnecting what had been cut off. It was not immediate, but it was steady, bringing with it a sense that life was expanding once more. Yet, even as normalcy began to return, the effects of the siege remained. Not always visible, not always spoken about, but present. People had changed. Priorities had shifted. The experience of prolonged scarcity and uncertainty left its mark, shaping how individuals and communities approached the future. There was also a certain irony in how quickly the extraordinary became ordinary again. Markets reopened, streets filled, daily routines resumed. The siege, which had once defined every moment, gradually became just another part of the city's history. Something to be remembered, but no longer lived. For those who had been children during the siege, the experience carried a different kind of weight. It shaped their understanding of the world in quiet ways. What others might see as stability, they understood as something that could change, quickly and without much warning. It was not a lesson taught directly, but one absorbed over time. The walls, which had been central to the entire experience, remained, repaired, reinforced, sometimes expanded. They stood as both protection and reminder, a physical symbol of what had happened and a quiet acknowledgement that it could, in theory, happen again. Because history, as it often does, had a habit of repeating its patterns. In the broader sense, siege warfare itself did not disappear. It continued in different places, at different times, following the same slow, deliberate logic. Surround, wait, endure, break. It was not a method defined by speed or spectacle, but by patience and persistence. A kind of warfare that relied less on sudden action and more on the steady pressure of time. And perhaps that is what made it so difficult in its own quiet way. There were no clear moments of heroism, no single turning point that defined everything. Instead, there was just the passage of days, each one adding a little more weight, a little more strain, until something finally gave. As the city settled into its new reality, the siege became a memory, still present, still influential, but no longer immediate. Life moved forward, as it always does, carrying with it the lessons, the scars, and the quiet understanding of what had been endured. And so, the story of the siege came to its natural end, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a gentle fading, a long, slow chapter closing, leaving behind a sense of stillness and the quiet reminder that sometimes the most difficult battles are not the loudest ones, but the ones that simply refuse to end until everything else has worn away. Defeat in the world of pre-modern warfare was rarely a dramatic final scene with a clear ending. It was usually something slower, more awkward, and deeply inconvenient for everyone involved, especially the people who had just lost. Armies didn't simply vanish after defeat. They lingered, they scattered. They tried to look dignified while very much not being in a dignified situation. And if you were a soldier in that moment, your future depended less on heroism and more on timing, luck, and whether anyone important still remembered your name. In the immediate aftermath of a lost battle, confusion was often the most reliable outcome. Lines that had once been organized dissolved quickly. Orders stopped making sense. Messengers disappeared, sometimes quite literally. What had been a structured force just hours before turned into something much looser, more chaotic. Soldiers who had marched in neat formations were now focused on a much simpler objective: getting away in one piece. Retreat, despite how it sounds, was not always a clean or orderly process. It could begin as a controlled withdrawal, with officers attempting to maintain some structure, but it rarely stayed that way for long. As pressure increased, the retreat often shifted into something less coordinated. Units became separated, communication broke down, and gradually the idea of a retreating army turned into smaller groups of individuals moving in roughly the same direction, hoping it was the right one. For commanders, this moment was particularly uncomfortable. They had gone from giving confident orders to managing a situation that resisted management. Some tried to regroup their forces, calling for order, attempting to re-establish control. Others quietly accepted that the battle, and perhaps their authority over it, was already over. Leadership in defeat required a different kind of skill, one that not everyone possessed. Among the soldiers, priorities changed quickly. Loyalty to the larger cause remained, at least in theory, but immediate survival took precedence. Staying with a unit was useful if the unit still existed in a meaningful way, but if it didn't, individuals made practical decisions. They followed whoever seemed to know where they were going, or they simply followed the crowd, because in moments like this, the crowd often felt like the safest option. Some soldiers attempted to maintain appearances, keeping their armor on, holding onto their weapons, as if the structure of the army still existed around them. Others adapted more quickly, shedding heavy equipment to move faster. A shield, while useful in battle, became less appealing when it slowed you down during a retreat. Practicality, once again, quietly overruled tradition. The battlefield itself, once the center of attention, was left behind with surprising speed. The focus shifted away from where the fight had taken place to where the survivors could go next. Roads, forests, rivers, these became the new landscape of the defeated army. Each offered its own challenges, but also its own possibilities for escape. For those who managed to stay in organized groups, there was often an effort to reach a safe location. A friendly city, a fortified position, or even just a defensible piece of land where they could pause and regroup. These destinations were not always close, and reaching them required both endurance and a certain amount of optimism. Not everyone had that option. Some soldiers found themselves isolated, cut off from the main body of the army. Their situation was quieter, but no less difficult. Without the support of a group, they had to rely on their own judgment, navigating unfamiliar terrain, avoiding enemy patrols, and making decisions with very little information. Meanwhile, the victors faced their own set of decisions. What to do with the defeated was not always straightforward. Pursuit was one option, attempting to turn a retreat into a complete collapse. But pursuit required energy, coordination, and a willingness to extend beyond the safety of the battlefield. It was effective when done well, but not always practical. In many cases, the victors chose a more measured approach. They secured the battlefield, gathered what remained, and assessed their own situation. Victory, after all, came with its own costs. Soldiers needed rest, supplies needed to be accounted for, and the broader strategy had to be considered. Chasing a defeated army too far could create new risks, something experienced commanders understood. For the defeated soldiers, capture was always a possibility, and one that varied widely in its consequences. Some were taken as prisoners, their fate tied to negotiations, ransom, or labor. Others were simply disarmed and released, particularly if they were not considered valuable enough to keep. The experience depended heavily on who had captured them and under what circumstances. Among higher-ranking individuals, the situation could be oddly more stable. Nobles and officers were often treated differently, not out of kindness, but out of practicality. They held value. They could be exchanged, ransomed, or used as leverage. Their defeat, while certainly inconvenient, did not always lead to immediate hardship. In some cases, it led to a very extended and somewhat uncomfortable period of waiting. Back within the defeated army, as it moved further from the battlefield, there was a gradual shift from immediate survival to longer-term concerns. Where would they go? Would they regroup? Was there another army to join, another campaign to continue? These questions lingered, often without clear answers. Morale, unsurprisingly, was low. Not dramatically so, not in a way that led to sudden collapse, but in a quieter, more persistent sense. The confidence that had existed before the battle was gone, replaced by a more cautious outlook. Soldiers spoke less about victory and more about what had gone wrong, though even those conversations tended to fade quickly. Leadership, where it still existed, attempted to rebuild some sense of structure. Units were reorganized, roles were reassigned. There was an effort to restore order, even if it was only partial, because an army, even a defeated one, needed some level of organization to function moving forward. For some, the defeat marked the end of their participation in the war. They returned home, or attempted to. Not always successfully, but with the intention of leaving the conflict behind. War, after all, was not always a permanent condition. It was something people entered and, when possible, exited. Others remained, either by choice or necessity. They joined other forces, continued the campaign, or simply stayed within the military structure because there was nowhere else to go. For them, defeat was not an ending, but a transition. One chapter closing, another beginning, often without much pause in between. The experience of defeat also carried a certain quiet education. Soldiers learned what worked and what didn't, what could be relied upon and what could not. These lessons were not always formally acknowledged, but they influenced future actions in subtle ways. A defeated army, if it survived, often returned with a slightly different perspective. Over time, as distance from the battlefield increased, the immediate intensity of the defeat began to fade. It did not disappear, but it became less central. Daily concerns, food, shelter, direction took precedence. Life, even in this altered form, continued. And so the defeated army moved on, not in triumph, not in glory, but in a quieter, more uncertain way. It was no longer the force it had been, but it was not entirely gone either. It existed in that space between past and future, carrying with it the memory of what had happened, and the quiet question of what would come next. As the defeated army drifted farther from the battlefield, something subtle but very important began to happen. The sense of being part of a single force slowly gave way to smaller identities. Groups formed based on familiarity rather than command. Friends stayed with friends. Soldiers from the same region clustered together. It was less about rank now, and more about who you trusted to walk beside you without asking too many difficult questions. The roads these soldiers followed were not always chosen with great strategy. Sometimes they led toward known safe places, fortified towns, allied territories, or familiar landscapes. Other times they were simply the most obvious paths away from danger. A wide road felt reassuring. A forest path felt hidden. A river could guide direction. Decisions were made quickly, often without much debate, because standing still was rarely considered a good option. Food once again became a central concern. Supplies carried into battle had not been meant for long retreats. What little remained was shared carefully, though not always evenly. Foraging became common. Fields were searched. Villages, when encountered, were approached with cautious hope. Not every place welcomed a group of tired, armed strangers, even if those strangers looked more exhausted than threatening. For the people living in those villages, the arrival of defeated soldiers was an event met with mixed feelings. On one hand, there was sympathy. These were men who had clearly endured something difficult. On the other hand, there was concern. Resources were limited, and a large group, even a weakened one, could place strain on a small community. So hospitality, when offered, was often measured and brief. Among the soldiers themselves, conversations took on a quieter tone. There was less talk of grand plans or future victories. Instead, discussions focused on immediate needs. Where to go next? Who might still be nearby? Whether it was worth trying to find the remnants of their original unit, or simply continue on independently. These were practical questions, shaped by the reality of their situation. Occasionally, rumors would surface of regrouping forces, of commanders gathering survivors, of new opportunities to rejoin the fight. These rumors moved quickly, carried from one group to another. Some chose to follow them, adjusting their path in hopes of finding structure again. Others listened, nodded, and kept walking in their original direction, perhaps less convinced. For officers who remained with their men, this phase required a different kind of leadership. Authority could no longer rely on strict discipline or formal hierarchy. It had to be maintained through presence, through decision-making that felt reasonable, and through a certain quiet persistence. An officer who could guide a group through this uncertain time without losing their trust was quite valuable. Not all officers succeeded in this. Some found their authority fading as the structure around them dissolved. Orders were questioned more often or simply ignored. It was not always out of disrespect, but out of necessity. When survival is the priority, decisions tend to become more personal, less tied to rank. The physical condition of the soldiers continued to influence everything. Injuries sustained during the battle, once manageable, became more difficult to deal with over time. Without proper care, even minor wounds could become serious. Movement slowed. Rest became more important, but also harder to secure safely. It was a delicate balance, constantly shifting. Weather, as always, played its quiet role. Rain made travel slower and less comfortable. Cold added strain to already tired bodies. Heat drained energy more quickly. None of these factors were dramatic on their own, but together they shaped the experience in subtle, persistent ways. Meanwhile, the victors, having secured their immediate success, began to extend their influence outward. Patrols might be sent to monitor the surrounding area to ensure that the defeated army did not regroup too quickly or too effectively. These patrols added another layer of caution for the retreating soldiers, who now had to consider not just where they were going, but who might be watching. Encounters between these patrols and scattered groups of defeated soldiers were often brief and uneven. Sometimes they resulted in capture. Other times, the smaller group managed to avoid detection entirely. Much depended on timing, terrain, and a certain amount of quiet luck. Back among the retreating forces, there was a gradual realization that the army, as it had existed before, was no longer a single entity. It had become a collection of smaller stories, each group following its own path, making its own decisions. The idea of a unified force remained, but it was now more memory than reality. Some groups eventually found their way to safer locations, fortified towns that still held allegiance to their cause. There they could rest, recover, and perhaps reconnect with a larger structure. These arrivals were not celebrated, but they were acknowledged. Each returning group added a small piece back to what had been lost. Others continued moving for longer periods, uncertain of where safety truly lay. Borders shifted, alliances changed. What had once been friendly territory might no longer be so. This uncertainty required constant adjustment, a willingness to change direction when necessary, even if it meant retracing steps. For those who chose to leave the conflict entirely, the journey took on a different tone. The goal was no longer regrouping, but returning, home, or something resembling it. This path was not always straightforward. War had a way of altering landscapes, both physical and political, but the intention remained, steady and quiet. There was also a small number who found opportunity in the aftermath of defeat. Mercenary work, for example, offered a way to continue using their skills, though in a different context. These individuals adapted quickly, shifting allegiance not out of loyalty, but practicality. It was not a romantic choice, but it was a functional one. As time passed, the immediate sense of loss began to soften, though it never fully disappeared. The defeat became part of a larger narrative, something that could be reflected on rather than constantly felt. Stories were shared, lessons considered, though often without much formal discussion. Among those who eventually regrouped into a new force, there was a noticeable change in perspective. Experience had reshaped expectations. Confidence, while not gone, was more measured. Plans were considered more carefully. There was a quiet understanding that things could go wrong and that preparation mattered. And yet, even with all these changes, life continued in its steady way. The defeated army, or what remained of it, moved forward. Not with the same certainty as before, but with a kind of quiet resilience. They adapted, adjusted, and carried on, because that, more than anything else, was what survival required. In the end, defeat did not erase them. It transformed them. It scattered them, reshaped them, and set them on paths that were less predictable but still very much in motion. And as they walked those uncertain roads, one step at a time, they carried with them not just the memory of what had been lost, but the possibility, however distant, of what might still be rebuilt. For many defeated soldiers, the story did not continue on open roads or quiet villages. It paused, quite abruptly, in the form of captivity. Capture was not always dramatic. Sometimes it happened during the chaos of retreat. Sometimes it came later, after a group had grown too tired to move quickly or too visible to remain unnoticed. However it happened, the result was the same, a sudden shift from movement to stillness. The first moments of capture were often surprisingly calm. Weapons were taken, sometimes with little resistance. Instructions were given, usually simple and direct. Sit here, stay there, do not move. There was no need for elaborate commands. The situation itself made everything clear. The defeated understood their position, and the victors had little reason to complicate it. For ordinary soldiers, captivity meant uncertainty. They were gathered, counted, and held, often in temporary conditions. Camps, open fields, or repurposed buildings became holding spaces. Comfort was not a priority. The goal was containment, not convenience. Days were marked by waiting, with very little to do except think, observe, and occasionally speak in quiet tones with those nearby. Food in captivity was sufficient in the most basic sense, enough to keep people alive, but rarely more than that. It was a continuation of the simplicity many had already experienced during the retreat, though now without the freedom to seek alternatives. Meals arrived when they arrived. There was no control over quantity or quality, only acceptance. Time, as it often does in such situations, began to stretch. Without movement or clear purpose, days felt longer. Conversations repeated themselves. Stories were told and retold, not because they changed, but because there was little else to fill the silence. The past became a frequent topic. what had happened, what might have been done differently, though these discussions rarely led to conclusions. For higher-ranking individuals, captivity took on a slightly different tone. Nobles, officers, and other figures of importance were often separated from the general group, not out of generosity, but because they held value. Their presence could be used in negotiations, their release exchanged for payment or political advantage. It was a quieter, more calculated form of detention. These individuals might find themselves in more stable accommodations, a guarded house perhaps, or a designated section of a fortress. Conditions were still controlled, still restrictive, but less harsh. They were, in a sense, investments, assets to be preserved rather than simply contained. It was an odd kind of privilege, shaped entirely by circumstance. Ransom became a central concept in this part of the story. Messages were sent, terms discussed, sums calculated. The process was not immediate. It required communication across distances, agreement between parties, and the movement of resources. In the meantime, those involved simply waited, their future tied to negotiations happening somewhere far away. For the captors, managing prisoners was a task that required attention, but not constant effort. Guards were assigned, supplies allocated. It was another responsibility added to the aftermath of victory, not particularly glamorous, but necessary, because releasing prisoners too soon or losing control of them could create new problems. Among the prisoners, there was a quiet hierarchy. Rank still mattered, even in captivity. Officers might receive slightly better treatment. Those with useful skills could find small ways to improve their situation. A physician, for example, might be allowed to assist others. A craftsman might be given materials to work with. These roles did not change the overall condition, but they added small variations to daily life. Escape, naturally, was considered, not always attempted, but often discussed. The idea held a certain appeal, regaining freedom, returning to familiar ground, but the practical challenges were significant. Guards, unfamiliar surroundings, and the risk of failure made it a difficult option. For many, the uncertainty of escape outweighed its potential benefits. Over time, a kind of routine developed within captivity. It was not imposed so much as it emerged naturally. People adapted to their circumstances. They found ways to pass the time. Conversations, quiet observations, small activities. These filled the hours. It was not a fulfilling existence, but it was manageable. Outside the prisoner camps, negotiations continued at their own steady pace. Letters traveled back and forth. Messengers carried information across long distances. Decisions were made slowly, influenced by politics, resources, and priorities that extended beyond the individuals directly involved. It was a process that required patience from everyone, though patience was not always easy to maintain. For some prisoners, release came eventually. Terms were agreed upon, payments made, and arrangements finalized. The moment of release was, again, not dramatic. It was procedural, names checked, conditions confirmed, and then, simply, the opportunity to leave. A quiet transition from one state to another. Returning from captivity carried its own adjustments. The world outside had continued during their absence. Situations had changed. Armies had moved. Alliances had shifted. Those who returned had to find their place again, often with limited information and a need to adapt quickly. Not all prisoners experienced release. Some remained in captivity for extended periods, their situation unresolved. For them, time continued its slow passage, marked by the same routines, the same conversations, the same uncertain waiting. It was not a dramatic fate, but it was a persistent one. Among those who had avoided capture entirely, stories of captivity circulated. They were listened to with interest, sometimes with concern, and occasionally with a certain quiet relief. Because while defeat was difficult, captivity added another layer of experience, one that not everyone was eager to share. As the broader conflict continued, the presence of prisoners remained a constant factor. They represented both a cost and a resource. Managing them required attention, but they also offered opportunities for negotiation. It was a balance maintained over time, shaped by the ongoing needs of both sides. And so, the story of the defeated army extended beyond the battlefield and the retreat. It moved into this quieter phase, defined by waiting, negotiation, and gradual resolution. Not every outcome was the same, but the pattern remained familiar: capture, containment, and the slow, steady passage of time. In the end, captivity was less about dramatic moments and more about endurance, about how individuals adapted to stillness after movement, to uncertainty after action. It was another chapter in the long story of defeat, one that unfolded not with noise, but with a quiet persistence that shaped everything that came after. For those who eventually left captivity, whether through ransom, exchange, or simple release, the return to the outside world was not as triumphant as one might imagine. There were no grand welcomes waiting at every road, no dramatic reunions playing out in slow motion. Instead, there was a quiet re-entry into a world that had, somewhat inconveniently, continued without them. The journey back was often slower than expected, not because of obstacles necessarily, but because of uncertainty. Where exactly should they go? The place they had left might no longer be the same. Armies had moved, borders had shifted, even familiar towns could feel slightly unfamiliar, as if time had gently rearranged everything while they were away. Physically, many of them were not quite the same either. Captivity, even under relatively stable conditions, had a way of softening strength. Muscles weakened, endurance faded. Recovery was possible, but not immediate. It required time, food, and a certain patience, something they had by now become quite familiar with. Mentally, the adjustment was quieter, but just as present. The structure of captivity, strange as it was, had at least been predictable. Life outside was less so. Decisions had to be made again, directions chosen, and with that came the subtle pressure of responsibility, something that had been temporarily set aside. For those returning to military life, the transition could feel oddly circular. They rejoined forces that had continued to operate, sometimes under new leadership, sometimes with altered objectives. The war, it seemed, had not paused in their absence. It simply carried on, expecting them to step back in as if nothing had changed. Of course, things had changed. Experience had reshaped their perspective. The memory of defeat, of retreat, of captivity, it all lingered. It influenced how they approached new situations. There was often a greater caution, a more measured approach to risk. Not fear exactly, but awareness. Commanders, when they received returning soldiers, had their own calculations to make. These were individuals with experience, which was valuable. But they were also individuals who had been through defeat, which required consideration. Reintegrating them into a functioning force meant balancing these factors carefully. Some found it easier to step away from military life altogether. They returned to civilian roles, or attempted to. Farming, trade, crafts, whatever options were available. This transition was not always smooth. War had a way of altering habits, expectations, even identity. Adjusting to a quieter life required time and sometimes guidance. Communities, when receiving these returning individuals, responded in varied ways. There was often a quiet acknowledgement of what had been endured, but not always a deep understanding. Stories were shared, but not always fully grasped. The experience of defeat and captivity was difficult to translate into everyday conversation. Among the higher ranks, the consequences of defeat could be more visible. Reputations were affected, positions reconsidered. Some leaders managed to recover their standing, particularly if the defeat could be explained, justified, or balanced by future success. Others found their careers quietly redirected or simply concluded. There was also a certain selective memory at play. Victories tended to be remembered more clearly, more proudly. Defeats, while not forgotten, were often softened over time. Details blurred, emphasis shifted. It was not dishonesty exactly, but a natural adjustment in how stories were told and retold. Yet among those who had experienced it directly, the memory remained more precise. They remembered the retreat, the uncertainty, the long wait. These were not dramatic moments, but they were persistent ones, shaping how the past was understood on a personal level. Over time, the defeated army, as a concept, faded into something less immediate. It became part of a larger narrative, one event among many in a long sequence of campaigns and conflicts. New battles took place. New outcomes emerged. Attention shifted forward, as it tends to do. But the lessons of defeat did not disappear entirely. They influenced planning, strategy, and decision-making in subtle ways. Commanders who had seen an army break were often more cautious in how they deployed their forces. Soldiers who had endured retreat were more attentive to signs of instability. Experience, even difficult experience, had its uses. There was also a broader understanding that defeat was not an end, but a phase. Armies could be rebuilt, structures restored, confidence regained, though perhaps in a different form. The cycle of conflict allowed for this kind of renewal, even if it was not always immediate or easy. For those who had moved on from war, the experience settled into memory more gradually. It became part of their personal history, something that shaped their outlook, but did not define every moment. Life continued as it always does, bringing new concerns, new routines, new priorities. Occasionally, when conversations turned to the past, the topic of that defeat would surface, not in a dramatic way, but in passing. A story shared, a detail mentioned. These moments served as quiet reminders, connecting the present to what had come before. The landscape itself often retained traces of what had happened. Roads once used for retreat, fields that had seen movement, confusion, change. These places did not announce their history loudly, but they held it, quietly embedded in their form. And so the story of what happened to defeated armies comes to a close not with a single event, but with a gradual fading. From battlefield to retreat, from capture to return, from immediate experience to distant memory. It is a story defined less by sudden endings and more by continuous adjustment. In the end, defeat was not simply about loss, it was about transformation. About how individuals and groups adapted to a changed reality and how they carried that experience forward into whatever came next. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, in the quiet way that history so often unfolds.